Morning all, let's have a look at the very exciting clash in round 7 between Hikaru Nakamura, the US #1 player, against Magnus Carlsen, the highest rated female player in the world at the moment. So Naka kicked off with e4 and Magnus plays the Sicilian defence. After knight f3 we see knight c6, as though potentially there's an invitation for a Sveshnikov, or more commonly nowadays the anti-Sveshnikov of bishop b5 is a very playable option for white, increasing hugely in popularity over the last few years. But d4 could be like a Sveshnikov. Okay, but here Naka plays actually the rather insipid move c3. This borrows some ideas from the Ruy Lopez. White's trying to construct a centre classically. To occupy the centre with two pawns like this is often seen as a source of advantage. Now black's reaction is kind of hyper modern. It's knight f6, and we're transposing him to a standard variation of the c3 Sicilian. c3 Sicilian territory was popularised in the UK for many years, since a grandmaster called Murray Chandler wrote a landmark work on it. So in the UK this has been a very popular system over many years, and in fact if you want to play the morra-smith gambit against the Sicilian, it often transposes into c3 Sicilian territory as well. Here white plays now e5, which is the critical move. In the second pass we'll do some reference checks and look in more detail at these at this opening and technically at the game. Knight d5. Okay, with this system white's knight can't come to challenge d5. The c3 square is taken away. Furthermore, because white has played c3, it will be another tempo to kick the knight. So there's a lot of logical justification behind this provocation here, and black's strategy usually is a light square strategy from this position. White is weakening some of the light squares by pushing on with e5, like this square. These squares are potentially vulnerable. So this bishop is quite important actually to try and maintain usually. It comes here now to bishop c4, and we see the move e6 here. Black doesn't mind at all the double pawns, that's fine, usually fine. So the more theoretical move now is d4. Black now takes on d4, and we see c takes d4, which does give white the c3 square potentially, but is that attractive to actually try and use in this position? Because black's option of knight c3 could be very handy. Okay, black actually plays d6, and after castles, bishop e7. White doesn't play knight c3. An alternative though might be bishop d5, a more viable alternative, knight c3, but that's a bit of a drawish reputation really. But this next move is more attacking, for attacking players, keeping the pieces on. Queen e2, maintaining a strong point, that e5 pawn, which can be used sometimes as an attacking basis. Now black castles, and we see rook d1, and Magnus now plays queen c7. Okay, now in this position it would be nice for this bishop to come to this diagonal, but there is certain harassment possible with knight b4 or knight b4 here. If the bishop goes to d3, it could be very annoying. So this next move seems quite logical in this position, to play the move a3, and it all looks fairly standard stuff so far. If white can at least try and provoke some weaknesses with, for example, a battery like this to provoke g6, then there'll be some dark square weaknesses to play upon. Black now plays rook d8, and interestingly white now plays b4, and I think one of the ideas is to try and also get the rook into play, like this for example, because without this rook, will white's attack be successful? It's like playing a rook down. If black uses both rooks and tries to defend, black will have more active pieces. So trying to get this rook into the game seems a very good idea. Also, white might be threatening in some cases b5. So black stops b5 in any case, among other things, as well as potentially now playing b5 here himself. And the bishop now comes back knowing it can't be harassed. At the moment these threats are pretty harmless. Black can always play g6. Black actually plays now the move b5, in fact, which fixes down this structure, and maybe black's intending to play something like takes and a5 at some point to try and undermine this structure. A very, very interesting move now is played by Naka, which looks a bit crazy in some respects. It's like white's been playing on the queen side and in the centre with these advances, and now plays on the king side as well with h4. It seems a bit surprising, but okay. We'll check out in detail, as I say, in the second pass, other alternatives and stuff. Black now takes on e5, white takes on e5. So potentially with h4, this g5 square could potentially be more useful for an operation like bishop g5, as well as also potentially queen e4 and h5, combinations of h5 or queen e4 to soften up the black king. So not only at the moment controlling g5, but also for h5, this pawn could be useful and justified. Bishop b7, black is just naturally developing. And now Naka proceeds with his plan of trying to get this rook into the game, and perhaps here to pin that knight. He plays the move rook a2. And now we see a very, very interesting move from Magnus in this position, which in many respects seems quite logical, especially considering this bishop can be considered the attacking piece. To get rid of this bishop would be a kind of defensive achievement for king safety. Can you spot what Magnus played in this position if I give you 10 seconds, or you might want to pause the video? So starting from now. Okay, Magnus plays knight d takes b4, so forking here, sacrificing a knight now for 2 pawns. So it is taken. There doesn't seem to be too many alternatives there, and we see knight takes b4, and this bishop is now vulnerable, in fact, so white has to be careful about knight takes d3 and having this bishop loose. So this next move addresses that white's still holding this bishop with the rook even after the knight takes. For example, there's rook takes, white can still hold c1 here. Black plays rook takes d3 in this position, rook takes d3, knight takes d3, so the rook can't be used because of c1, so queen takes d3. So a very interesting position, and now more simplification forced by Magnus with rook d8. Queen goes to e2, and our rook takes d1, queen takes d1. So we have a very interesting position. Potentially 2 connected pass pawns, they will gain in strength as they're pushed forward. So this is potential dynamism here. And we've also got the bishop pair, a very interesting moment in the game. And technically there's an opportunity now to win an extra pawn here, to make it 2 pawns for the piece, which is very, very tempting. Bishop takes f3, but it might not be the best move. Chess is a very complex game. By taking on f3, it does force g-takes because of this bishop issue, which means also queen takes e5 wins another pawn. And if you look at the position, you could see how tempting this is to play the move bishop takes f3. But there are other possibilities which just go with this primary imbalance of the bishop pair and these passed pawns, which can be starting to be very aggressive and useful, and maybe compensate in their own right for that knight, especially in conjunction with this bishop pair. But Magnus goes for the very tempting continuation here, and we'll check out in the second pass other possibilities. He goes for bishop takes f3. So clearly white can't take on f3 because he's losing that bishop. So he has to also get this horrible structure now with h4 also loose. So that's why it's also very tempting. It's not just this third pawn, but this pawn over here, which is now fractured. So we see queen takes e5. Okay, can Naka really survive this position? I think during the game, commentators were giving black with huge prospects here, as though black was got all the play and it was difficult for white not to lose this position. But this next move starts to cast a shadow over black's assets rather. This next move, queen d7. The queen is trying to pin this bishop as well as hold the pawns. It's trying to do two things here. So if it can go to e8 and this bishop's pinned, and it can try and hold these pawns or try and win one of them later, then the power of those pawns is significantly reduced. Now here, Magnus can't go in for check. It's not going to be that good. And we'll check this out in the second pass, but very briefly just mentioning this. A check here, king g2 takes. Okay, there's queen takes e7, and there isn't time to take here because of the mate threat. And if black does something about that, then something like queen d8 check, king h7 and queen d3 check would mean the knight's rescued with knight c3. And we'll look at that in detail in the second pass. But basically, black cannot simply mop up these two pieces here with queen e1 check. Black plays now bishop f8, and the first row is shielded with bishop e3 from the queen. Now these pawns, which are the major primary asset of black, they're starting to be pushed with a5, which seems promising here. Okay, but this next move creates a very, very nasty pin, queen e8. Okay, what is this pin actually doing here? It seems, of course, bishop c5 is at the moment ruled out. But what if this knight, for example, tries to come in the game, knight d2 to e4, then bishop c5 is very dangerous. Okay, and there's also maybe a possibility of being annoying with f4, but really this knight, if that's improved, that's the main thing about this position, as well as holding these pawns. Okay, in this position, Magnus decides to play the move h6. Clearly we need to examine the pawn pushes here and what exactly happens, which would be so bad. But another possibility would simply be, after b4, trying to set up a light square blockade as well. But this pin is very useful as well. So black is tied up and maybe feeling some doubt now over his piece sacrifice. King g2 now is played, which really rules out any f4s. You don't want to have a check here. So king g2 just improves the king, maybe in preparation for the knight moving, but it really now depends what is black doing with the pawns. Black now commits a pawn with a4, and in fact this provokes the knight not to go to this square but actually come to attack this b5 pawn. So the queen and the knight are now coordinating on b5. Now this pawn is pushed, giving up the c4 square, which is pounced in, knight c4. Black queen must try and keep control of c5 here, otherwise this is really dangerous with this pin. So we see queen c7. And here, okay, attacking the knight, so white hasn't got time for taking here, but he plays knight b6. And there's an immediate threat now, knight d7, using that pin. And the bishop protecting this means that, hold on, what is black doing here? this is really dangerous. Magnus has to defend, for example, against knight d7. He plays actually queen e7, giving up one of his pawns, but an exchange move for this one. White perhaps doesn't want to exchange queens here and take on a4, because I think that's quite simple to draw after taking on h4. Black could set up a kind of fortress position by moving the bishop up back and playing g5 there. So okay, white takes on a4, trying to preserve maybe some winning chances, because maybe the chances are with white a little bit now. Queen takes h4, and now back for this horrendous pin with queen a8. So knight d7 again threatened. That's parried with queen e7, and we see queen c8 again, potentially now knight d7 on the cards. But now we see b3, this pawn being used. Knight d7 played, b2. Now we see knight takes f8. Okay, what happens if queen, well, knight g6, for example, check, would be quite nice, winning the queen. But here, queen takes f8 then is played, and we see queen b7 holding up the pawn. Okay, in this position, has Magnus really blown it here? He's only got 2 pawns for the piece. He's going to lose this pawn, surely. Can he try and hold on to this pawn, you might ask? With, say, queen a3. It's doubtful because of the move, for example, bishop d4, but we'll check in the second pass. But bishop d4 would seem to win that pawn anyway. So Magnus actually plays e5 here, giving up b2, and now f6. So this construction here is going to be difficult for white to break down. Doesn't really want to play a move like f4. He's like weakening this diagonal, which can be pounced on immediately, for example with queen a8 if needed. White plays now queen c2, and we see queen f7. Okay, so what is white trying to do here as a major plan? What is black trying to do? Well, black's got access to g6 here, so white's maybe concerned about that, keeping an eye on g6. He plays queen f5. Now black doesn't want to weaken pawns unnecessarily. He just plays king h8 here, seeing what white will do. Bishop d2, king g8, king g3, king h8, just waiting now for black, moving the king backwards and forwards, and white's waiting a bit. Queen d3, king h8 again, and now a committal move, f4. Black now takes on f4, bishop takes, so only 1 pawn now potentially for queening. King g8, again waiting. Magnus is just waiting, f4, waiting again. Okay, and here it becomes clear that white hasn't really got a constructive plan to win this. After king h8 they agreed a draw. Very interesting game. I think we should flip the board and now do a second pass technical analysis. In this position, the engine might think white's got a slight advantage, but if there's no way to break down the black position, then it doesn't mean anything. Okay, for example, well, if we go with the engine move queen f5, the engine's not really in these lines actually constructing anything meaningful for white, hence the evaluation is staying roughly the same. So it's not finding anything which the players haven't seen. Okay, so let's go back in the game. Very interesting game. So we have a c3 Sicilian, and there was actually a post-mortem review of this game by both players, and Naka was asked why he was playing like the c3 Sicilian, and he recognised it was popular in the UK actually. So when in the UK, why not play like UK style, which was quite interesting. So bishop c4, we see e6 is a standard position at the c3 Sicilian. C takes d4, d6, all very standard. Queen e2, natural move. Rook d1. Okay, keeping the structure intact. Knight c3 is also interesting, as well as bishop d5, but I don't think they offer white much. If bishop d5, knight c3, it's not really offering much here. In fact, technically it seems that the engine actually likes this for black, this position. So no, keeping that light square bishop is desirable here. So we see queen c7, a3. Now after rook d8 we see the move b4. And let's actually start to do a reference track actually from this position here. So I'm clicking my reference tab in Chess-Based Light, and 1324 games found. Okay. Now actually the most common move on my database here is actually knight 1 to c3. It's been played by many good players. Rajabov, Adams, pardon me, I think I shouldn't have done that arrow. Let's just go back there. Knight 1 to c3 is the most common. Queen e4, so that's with 476 games. Queen e4 with 369. Rook fd1 is the third most common. Wróblewski, Nispeno, Chaikov has played this rook fd1. But exponents of queen e4 include Ponomarev, Kuchayev, Dolmatov. But knight 1 to c3 has been played a lot, with a score of 55.9%. So quite a good winning percentage relative to the other lines. Okay, so rook fd1. Black's most common move here. Actually, you might find this very surprising, but the move knight c6 to a5 has been played a lot. 95 games. c8 to d7, 59 games. Queen to c7, 32 games. Okay, so Magnus chooses the third most popular. And we see a3 in this position, which is the third popular again from white. Bishop 1 to d2, 9 games I've got here. Bishop takes on d5, 7. a3, 4 games. And that, I'm wondering now about bishop d5 earlier. In fact, was that actually possible for white to play bishop d5 earlier in this position? It's actually not a move at all played here, bishop d5 at the moment. In this position, yes, it's just 1 c3, queen e4, rook fd1 is the third move, rook fe1 is the fourth most popular. There's only 2 games actually with bishop, it's not really played at all, bishop d5 here. It's when black commits to queen c7 that all of a sudden this is an interesting move, second most popular here. So the most popular is bishop to d2, interestingly. This a3 plan is the third most popular with 4 games, so let's go back into this. And we see rook d8. In this position, Magnus's rook d8, other alternatives, well, very limited game samples on my database here, actually. 1 game for knight b6, 1 for knight a5, d takes e5, 1 game, a6, rook fd8. Okay, so we're kind of out of book. b4 has been played before, at least in the game Olszewski against Flores Rios in 2005, which ended in a win with white. But white was only 2-3, 9-9, so much lower rated FIDE players playing b4 here. Okay, so let's have a look now. b4. Does the engine like that or hate it? It seems black's at least equal. So we see the move a6, bishop d3. Okay, black doesn't mind playing b5. I think queen e4 is pretty harmless here. If we check out queen e4, just g6, and it's a bit of a waste of time, it would seem. Rook a2 here, you might think. Maybe even a similar idea is possible of knight takes b4, but no, a5, bishop b7 also liked. With the queen on e4, it's just the target really for bishop b7, surely. So let's go back. After b5, we saw the move, the very interesting move, h4. And yes, black's advantage technically went up after h4. So what on earth was this? Was this preparation on Naka's part? In fact, let's have a look what the engine thinks here. Rook a2 here instead of h4, for example, is coming up as a possibility, or taking on d6. So that's interesting. h4. Magnus actually takes on e5, weakening white's centre a little bit. Playing now bishop b7. By taking on e5, he is exposing this d3 as a potential vulnerability. And rook a2 seems to just go into that awkward moment of this fork, which the engine actually really quite likes. Magnus's move here at depth 17, just to take with either knight actually, although it's leading to the same thing, it seems. So knight d takes b4. We have a position here quite light from an engine view. And now either again knight d3 or rook d3 is the same, leading to the same thing. There's no clever little move for white to change that. So knight takes d3, queen takes. And here we see it's necessary for black to play rook d8 in this position. I think white's actually threatening. What is white actually threatening here? Actually, bishop g5 could be interesting for white here as the major threat. Okay, so rook d8, queen e2, black taking. It seems technically the engine really likes black. And Magnus's move is what the engine really likes as well. Bishop takes f3. But in the post-mortem after the game, there are a lot of other interesting moves like h6 or b4 which really need to be considered. In fact, now the engine even likes h6, getting on with it. So not going for this extra pawn, but just depriving white of the g5 square. If we look at white's primary threats, bishop g5 is still an interesting possibility here to try and rule out. If we look at if white's given an extra move, or bishop e3, but bishop g5 is one of them, because then it creates this possibility maybe of queen d8. So if black rules that out by playing h6, this would be a very interesting position to consider. Just two pawns for the piece. For example, can we get the dynamism of the black pawns going? So say a5, and now this battery is also good for tying down this knight to g2. Very different game, of course, but black can play now with these pawns more without any problems with this bishop getting pinned like in the game. This looks like, to be honest, a pretty dire continuation for white if he's very, very passive like this. This queen a1 doesn't seem at all right. Let's get a queen exchange here and see what's happening here. So bishop a6. Let's just go with this. If these passed pawns gain in strength, do they reach a critical point for white? Just on this brief view. Okay. Bishop c5, trying to decoy the bishop away from diagonal force b2 and bishop d3 here. It starts to get really dangerous. For example, bishop takes, there's b2, I think it's just winning because of bishop d3. Okay. So this kind of thing is starting to be really dangerous for white. bishop e2. It's certainly looking a lot more promising for black than the game. So yes, chess is not an easy game, so it looks very, very tempting and lucrative to play the move bishop takes f3, but actually h6 might be a viable alternative here in this position, where these pawns could actually potentially give black a winning position. But bishop takes f3. Okay, so we see g takes, queen takes. Now very precise moves, I believe, from Necker. So queen d7, one of the very strongest moves in the position at this depth. In any case, from an engine point of view, queen d7. The queen is simultaneously tying down the bishop and these two pawns. So bishop f8. Now bishop e3, a very strong move. What is black actually threatening here? If we did a threat analysis, black's threatening, of course, queen e1 and then to mop up the bishop. So that has to be clearly addressed. What other way of doing that? Queen d3 for queen f1, not as good, perhaps. So bishop e3 seems very good. Also with possibilities now of bishop c5, potentially later, if the queen's going to pin this bishop. We see the move a5, which the engine really doesn't like. You see that significant evaluation change. So can black do something with this position? Queen a1, for example. Queen d3. This is also interesting, but okay. King g2, unpinning. And it might get dangerous now with this knight coming into the game. It's not so clear. I think white can try and blockade these pawns like this, and it starts to be in white's favour. So that's to be avoided, really. So, okay, we saw the move a5 and this very, very nasty pin. So yes, Magnus might have been regretting winning this third pawn. The third pawn might have been the poisoned pawn, slightly poisoned pawn. So with black suffering the ill consequences of that. So here, what is white actually threatening here? h6 was played in this position. If we do a threat analysis here, knight d2 and then knight e4, as mentioned, is the main thing. So h6, okay. Now in this position, what of knight d2? Is that playable as well? White played king g2, which the engine really likes. So what is going on here with, say, if we play knight d2? The point is revealed that the knight is also, like the queen, involved in monitoring these pawns. So this move, knight d2, it might actually be possible for black to play a4 here, and these pawns are getting dangerous, and the bishop is protecting both of them if they came here at the very least. So this kind of position, yes, the knight would have been nice on b1, better on b1 to be able to play knight takes a3 there. So it's important to be very, very delicate with this knight in this position. So king g2, very useful waiting move, it seems. So we see a4, so white controlling these pawns with knight a3 now. Okay, the knight coming to c4 is very, very dangerous. This route here, very dangerous for this pin. So we see that b4, knight c4. White's holding the balance very well. Knight b6. Magnus now tries queen e7, which is probably the best move in the situation now. So things have gone away from him. If we play any other move apart from queen e7, look at e5, the evaluation on e5. Why is that? e5, knight d7. If we play queen d6 here, bishop c5. And what's happening here? It seems it's a disaster because of this bishop on f8. Surely. Queen h5. It's a mop-up job. In fact, bishop e7 might even be stronger than taking immediately, just to hold on to h4 and then take with the knight. So that will be a total disaster. Okay. So queen d6 is not at all possible there. So e5 can't be played. So queen e7 necessary. Magnus finds maybe the only move in this position to stay in the game, in fact, now. Okay. White does best, perhaps, to take on a4, it seems, at this depth, rather than take the queens off. Let's take the queens off as an example. Knight takes a4. Again, this scenario, this piece should be able to tell here, surely. I think this evaluation will drop. Or will it be drawish? Will it be simply drawish, as mentioned before? Possibly on the drawish side. Because if nothing else, as Magnus mentioned in the post-mortem analysis of the game, there are certain circumstances where something like this structure with g5 and e5 to stop f4, and that might be really difficult. Okay, for black to crack. Well, especially if this bishop can be exchanged off for the knight somehow. But okay, let's go back here. So queen takes a4, exchanging off for the h4 pawn. Back for the pin to threaten now. I think white's now threatening knight d7, primary threat. That's parried. Queen e7, queen c8, primary threat again. Knight d7. We see b4. After knight d7 here. Okay, now white is threatening potentially. I would have thought white's threatening something like bishop c5, but no, bishop c1, even stronger, to not cut this pawn and play maybe bishop a3 later potentially, or just take on f8 and win that pawn later. So anyway, black plays b2. Any other options? e5 here, knight takes, queen b7, queen a3. In this position, actually, okay, this should be okay for white with at least a draw here. So anyway, so knight d7, we see b2. Now after knight takes, queen b7, stopping the pawn. I assumed it was fairly pointless to play queen a3 here. Let's have a look in this position. I thought just bishop d4 is good enough here for white to be doing very well. Or check first, then bishop d4. Okay, so bishop d4. Yeah, that's okay. It's good for white. So Magnus plays e5, and we have this kind of fortress now. Even though black is a piece down, it's for two pawns, and white's pawns are doubled here, which doesn't help. So white eventually tries for the f4 break in this position. In fact, it might be possible, if we saw this queen e4 for black to play, consider playing g5. It looks fairly committal, but it does kind of lock the bishop in. I think Magnus mentioned a similar thing to this in the post-game post-mortem analysis. So king h8, f4. Okay, and now we see Magnus not being tempted actually for g5, but just moving his king backwards and forwards, less committal, waiting for white to do something, and white wasn't really going to do anything here, so we get a draw. Okay, very interesting encounter indeed. Naka's showing great creativity with a3, b4 and then h4, playing everywhere, queenside, centre, kingside. Great tenacity to see through what optically was initially a very difficult position. But maybe Magnus had a lot better than trying to win that third pawn, which maybe was marked as slightly poisonous status. Instead, he had the opportunity for h6, as we saw, where these two pawns he had would have been quite interesting to play for a win. But the way he played it, Naka played very accurately to maintain the pin, maintain the potential blockades on the pawns, and very well timed knight movements to help also assist the queen on e8 in that game. So high precision play from white. Magnus may have overestimated the resulting positions after bishop takes f3. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.